This is More Money with economist Steve Moore. Now, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show. Boy, we have a busy show today. We have some great guests. I always say I'm not a very good radio talk show host, but I get some of the best guests. And our next guest coming up in just 1 minute is the great Scott Walker. You remember Scott Walker. He was the governor of Wisconsin. He was the one who really reformed that state in so many ways and cut the budget, got rid of the deficits, really made Wisconsin great again, if I may. And he is in the news now for a reason I'll mention in a few minutes. But first of all, let me introduce Governor Scott Walker. Governor, thank you so much for joining on this Saturday afternoon.
Hey, it's great to be with you again. Good to see you just a day ago. So it's awesome to be connected.
We were in Florida together and had a conference and had a great time chatting. A lot of things I want to ask you about, Governor, but one of them, I was telling my listeners earlier that today is December 7th. Right. A day that will live in infamy. And I'm going to ask my listeners today about any remembrance, if anyone's old enough to actually have lived through December 7, 1941. I'm not, but my parents talked about it all the time. I wonder about if you have any thoughts about this.
Well, absolutely. My mom was born December 30th, 1938. So she was just a young child, but she talks about my parents, her parents, my grandparents, and particularly I've got a pair of boots that my uncle Warren wore in the war. It was in the Pacific Theater, and then eventually made his way back and bought a motorcycle and rode that motorcycle with those boots. So they're in my office, both out of reverence to him and because we were the only two in our family who rode motorcycles. But also I posted today on the USS Arizona Memorial. One of the names there is Walter Bovio. I grew up in a small town in south central Wisconsin called Delavan. And Walter Bovio was a 19-year-old from my town of Delavan who was on the Arizona that day and who is forever entombed with his fellow sailors on that ship below the water there. So it's just very real to me because his name was on the side of our American Legion post.
You know, I was saying earlier on the show that we need a new patriotism in America, a new love of country. And you were the governor of Wisconsin, but I don't know if you've read these new American history textbooks, but they do not celebrate America. In fact, you read these textbooks now. I don't know why we allow this in the classroom. All they do is attack America as sort of responsible for all the problems in the world. And I mean, we know that we have stains in our history just like any country, but you and I think most of our listeners do believe that this is the greatest country on earth. And why is it that the left seems to want to highlight our failings rather than our successes?
Well, I think it's the work I do at Young America's Foundation with college, high school, and now middle school kids. We see it all the time. It's one of the biggest frustrations, but I think it's because it goes back to Marxism. Our country is built on freedom. We're the only country that's lasted as long as we have, nearly 250 years coming up on our anniversary in a year and a half, and a country based on the idea that all of us are created equal, that our creator, not our government, not the king, not a monarch, but that God gives us these rights. And that while we didn't always live up to that fully, we've been on the path towards a more perfect nation throughout this great history of this country. And that should be celebrated. We should teach the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, we should know about the parts you referenced where some of our leaders didn't live up to that promise made on July 4th, 1776, but we've been on that path. I think that's part of the challenge, but it's Marxists who years ago wanted to pit us one against the other based on class or income. That's how they've prevailed elsewhere in the world and then failed. In America, that doesn't work because anyone can live the American dream. So now it's based on race and sex and gender, and that's why they have to go in the textbooks and in the classrooms and claim somehow these awful, horrible things about the country, when this country, not only here for people here in America, but think about the freedom and opportunity that American-style capitalism has brought to the world.
Yes. Well, I couldn't agree more. Well said, Governor. And I did watch the Reagan movie just a couple of weeks ago, which I very much liked. And I wanted to bring that up because I forgot to mention that you, of course, run the fantastic Young America's Foundation, which is a wonderful organization, and people should support that if you don't already. I'm sure a lot of our listeners do. But you own the Reagan Ranch, and you have turned that into an incredible monument to Ronald Reagan. But those scenes in the movie, were they actually taken at the Reagan Ranch, Governor?
They were. I was right there. I was standing behind the oak tree up by the front by the ranch house. You've been a longtime speaker for us at Free Enterprise events and know about the ranch. And
yeah, sure. I've been there many times.
I was standing there when Penelope Ann Miller, who portrayed Mrs. Reagan, came out of the ranch house, and I said to Andrew Kaufman, our director, "Wow, that's a powerful moment." And when I saw it in the movie, it was even more powerful than I remembered. And I just such a wonderful one that they did it, but two, that they did a really accurate portrayal of the president, the first lady, and the team around him, and that it did so well. For all the hype and hysteria on the left, in the end, America wanted to see that story. And just recently, when it came out streaming and on DVD and Blu-ray, it actually was one of the top movies in America. So
I know. Well, that's what we did. We streamed it about 2 weeks ago, and it was, I think when I streamed it 2 weeks ago, it was number one of all the movies. Absolutely. And by the way, I love the fact that I have great remembrances of going to the to the ranch, and there's that one thing that I found so interesting, which was the bed. Is that the same bed that they actually slept in? Yeah. And that bed had, Reagan was what? How tall was he? About 6'4". He was a tall man, maybe 6'3", 6'4". And the bed, if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was too short. His legs were, and there's like an extension, a little stool extension on the bed. And I'm thinking, totally right. This is the most powerful man in the. What's that?
It mesmerizes not only people like you and I who remember President Reagan, but these students are so impressed. You think, what do they care about a guy who was, died long after they were even, or long before they were born? But they come and they see this was a real guy. He was just like our parents and grandparents. He lived what he talked about, frugality. He zip tied the two beds together, put the wood bench at the end of the bed because his feet hung off the end. He just lived it. And in turn, these kids then they ultimately want to read more about and go online and watch videos of Ronald Reagan and hear what he was talking about. And one of the most important things in his farewell address, you were just talking about this, he warned us that even though we got our spirit back and our patriotism back, we had to reinstitutionalize it. And he talked about learning American history and shared civic values, shared civic rituals, and that's exactly what we're missing in so many parts of society today.
So that's a good lead in to the original reason I asked you to come out. I have so much to talk to you about this afternoon, but you've been in the news a lot lately because, of course, you were the heroic governor who really took on some of the militant public unions in Wisconsin. And I don't even remember how long ago that was. I mean, it was in the 90s, I guess it was. I'm losing track of time. But the fact is that this was an incredibly important reform. You were so courageous in doing that. I think the first governor who really took on the public sector unions. And I'm not against unions, but I think some of these public sector unions are out of control. And now the courts have basically, and by the way, you could, if you wouldn't mind mentioning the insurrection that happened in Madison, Wisconsin when you did that. And now I learned from the Wall Street Journal that the courts in Wisconsin have overturned those reforms.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So it's been the rule of law for 13 years. It's been upheld in state and federal court time and time again. So it is settled case law. Yep. And yet they were just waiting. They tried to intimidate us when I first brought this up. It wasn't a few hundred. It wasn't a few thousand. It was 100,000 protesters occupied our Capitol for nearly a month. So obviously Occupy.
So hold on, time out, Governor, because this is a very important point you're making, and I want to make sure every one of my listeners understands what you're saying, because I remember this happening, that you had, because people talk about the quote insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol, and yet your Capitol was sieged by these protesters, not for a few hours, but days. Was it weeks? I don't even remember.
Weeks. But it was almost a month. Yeah, it was just shy of a month.
Yeah. Why didn't they call that an insurrection?
Well, and I remember I used to, instead of coming in the Capitol, I had to come in through the Justice Center under a tunnel underneath, and I'd go maybe a quarter mile across all this SWAT gear from all the law enforcement agencies in and around the state that had to come and help eventually take the Capitol back. But that's just how. And remember, it was Pelosi. You know, what a distorted memory she has. Pelosi was actually on then Twitter saying, you know, power to the unions,
power to the people.
You know, hold the Capitol down. I mean, they were you know, against. They were for occupying capitals before they were against it. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, well, you were exactly. Well, you were heroic, and your life was in danger. I know there were many death threats. But so, can you explain to my listeners, Governor, what exactly those reforms were? Because they seem very commonsensical to me.
Yeah, they went wild mainly because we took the power out of the hands of the big government union bosses and put it simply back into the hands of the hardworking people, the state, the taxpayers, and the people that they duly elect. So collective bargaining, which ironically started in Wisconsin eons ago, the last century, was really, as it is elsewhere across the country, it takes power out of hands of school board members and city council members and county board members and others because the unions get to call the shots. We stopped that. We pulled back on that. That's why they went just over the top, out of control on this. And then that's why they sent the protesters in, because they were trying to intimidate first me and then the legislature. We didn't back down. Then they tried to recall us. I was the first governor in American history to win a recall election.
Oh, I remember. Yes.
They went to court. And when that failed, each step of the way, the left, remember, I was passing this on to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to remember, the left never stops. So don't just assume because we won that we can do this.
That's so
Get
true.
ready for the courts. Get ready for all the administrative state. That's what happened to us, and that's what's going to happen to them in Washington.
So where do you go from here now? You've got this court that's overturned your reforms, but everyone I talk to in Wisconsin says they want these, you know, because how much money did you save?
According to the MacGyver Institute, one of the local think tanks, they projected originally over $16 billion. They just updated that this past year over $30 billion and counting.
For a state like Wisconsin, that's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money for sure. And if you privately talk to school board members in particular across the state, liberal or conservative alike, they'll tell you they'll be devastated if our Act 10 reforms go away. And so this judge, political payoff in Madison, the most liberal county in the state, signed the recall petition, didn't recuse himself. He overturns it largely because the state Supreme Court last year, remember, changed from a 4-3 conservative majority to a 4-3 liberal majority. Wow. Ultimately, it'll get appealed and then all the way up to the state of Wisconsin Supreme Court. And this spring in April, there is an election. One of the 4 liberals is retiring. And the key here is if Brad Schimel, the former attorney general, now a judge himself, if he is elected, the rule of law will be protected. If one of these liberal activists, like the last 3, is elected, not only is Act 10, our reforms we're just talking about, likely to go, but even things like school choice, the voucher program that's been around for more than 30 years, voter ID requirements I signed into law, a lot of really awful things. So people across the country should pay attention to this race and particularly pay attention to Brad Schimel. So
we've just got about 45 seconds left before we have a hard break. So Governor, one last question on the fly. I believe that I think that something very suspicious happened in that U.S. Senate race in Wisconsin. I was told that over 100,000 voters did same-day registration in Wisconsin. I don't think they had the right safeguards to make sure they were, you know, truly eligible voters. And the Republican lost that race by a hair. What is your thought about that race?
Eric Hovde would have been a fabulous U.S. Senator. Well, it goes back, it actually ties these two issues together. It's why we need to have not only a court that upholds the law, a Supreme Court, a high court that does that. So you have at a minimum voter ID. But then going forward, we need a governor and a legislature that can further tighten and ensure voter integrity. Because we see it in Wisconsin and all across the country in the battleground states, there's always problems, and we need to have elections where everybody, Republican and Democrat, and anywhere in between, can have faith in the system.
Thank you, Governor. That was Governor Scott Walker, the former governor of Wisconsin, who now runs the Young America's Foundation. Governor, thank you so much.